On a cold, clear afternoon in February of 2000, after a long, bumpy ride through snow-capped mountains, 15-year-old Ahmet Balik stepped off a bus into the city center of Erzurum, Turkey. The urban bustle was a culture shock for a country kid like him. He had spent his whole life in the small Turkish village where he was born, helping his family tend land and herd livestock. But 2 weeks earlier, Ahmet's uncle had found him a job in a textile factory in Erzurum. So here he was, surrounded by cars and buses and people, with businesses and cafes stretching down every block. It was a lot for Ahmet to process, but he was thrilled to be in this new environment and to start this exciting new chapter. He grabbed his bag from the bus's luggage compartment and headed straight for his new job. As he walked through the city, Ahmet had to stop every few blocks to catch his breath. Erzurum was a high, mountainous city, and so the air was thinner up there. He could feel the difference in his lungs. Eventually, Ahmet found the factory, walked inside, and introduced himself. His boss gave him a quick tour of the facility. As they walked around, Ahmet saw long rows of industrial looms and conveyor belts loaded with fabric, and he also saw another part of the building that was filled with workers hunched over sewing machines. Then, Ahmet followed his boss to a back area of the factory where narrow pallets were clustered in a corner. The man told him that was actually where many of the workers without families would sleep, since the hours were long and the factory was a good distance from most residential areas. Now, Ahmet really needed this job to work, and he would do whatever it took. So he smiled and tossed his bag on one of the pallets and followed his boss to begin his training. 4.5 years later, in July of 2004, Ahmet wiped the sweat from his face as he paced the crowded waiting room of a government hospital. He was 19 years old, but he felt much older. His life at the factory had been a whirlwind, getting up at dawn, shuffling to the assembly line, then sewing and finishing garments until dark. He and a couple other workers shared an apartment near the city center, but some nights he was too tired to make the walk back. So on those nights, he just curled up on the floor of the factory until it was time to get up and start the next day's shift. And before long, the late nights and early mornings began to take their toll. His sleep got worse, which only made the days feel longer. Ahmet also developed a bad cough, and gradually it got so severe that he began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. The exhaustion also affected his appetite, and he started losing weight. And this only made Ahmet feel weaker and more fatigued. It was a vicious cycle. A year earlier, in the fall of 2003, his condition had gotten so bad that he began making mistakes at work. He confused the measurements of seams and hems. He skipped entire steps of the production process. In November of that year, some shops complained about the quality of their orders, and the errors were traced back to Ahmet. When Ahmet's boss confronted him about the problem, Ahmet tried to pass it off as an accident, but Ahmet's boss could tell something deeper was wrong. So he removed Ahmet from the work schedule until his health improved. Without a job, Ahmet felt lost. His small amount of savings quickly dwindled. Ahmet tried to find other work, but Erzurum was full of young men who were hungry for similar jobs. And since Ahmet looked visibly ill, most employers turned him away. Ahmet had been able to scrape by on savings through the winter, but by the spring of 2004, Ahmet was broke. His roommates tried to be understanding, but told Ahmet that he would have to move out if he couldn't keep up with his share of the rent. And so, if Ahmet couldn't find a job soon, he would soon have no choice but to move back to his family's home in the country. Unfortunately, Ahmet's time away from the factory did not improve his health. He was still sleeping poorly, he felt run down, dizzy, and exhausted, and then one scorching summer morning in July, Ahmet woke up so out of breath that he couldn't even make it to a job interview he had booked. He realized something serious might be wrong with him, so Ahmet took a cold shower, threw on clothes, and dragged himself to the government hospital across town. Now, here he was, weak and lightheaded, pacing a waiting room full of sick people. An hour later, a nurse called Ahmet's name. He was taken to a treatment room where a tired-looking doctor listened while Ahmet described his symptoms. When he was done, the doctor told Ahmet he most likely had tuberculosis, commonly called TB, a contagious bacterial disease of the lungs. For hundreds of years, TB had been one of the world's deadliest diseases. But thanks to the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, it was now a very treatable illness. The doctor guessed that Ahmet had caught TB in the factory, since the disease spreads easily in confined spaces. All it takes is being near the wrong cough or sneeze. The doctor said that most likely the disease had lingered in his lungs ever since. Ahmet was surprised by the diagnosis, especially considering the doctor didn't actually run any tests. But it seemed like an obvious enough explanation, and he was honestly just relieved to have an explanation at all for his trouble breathing and fatigue. And so the doctor prescribed Ahmet medication that would stop the TB from being contagious within 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, all of Ahmet's symptoms would be gone. Ahmet was thrilled. If the doctor was right, he could be back in the factory within a month, making his full wages again. He wouldn't have to move back home after all. Even better, he would finally stop coughing and be able to sleep through the entire night. 1 month later, in August of 2004, a pulmonologist named Dr. Yusuf Kaya went to meet a new patient at the Ataturk University Clinic in Erzurum. The patient was a 19-year-old factory worker named Ahmet. He reported having trouble breathing, a painful cough, and intense fatigue. As soon as Dr. Kaya stepped into the treatment room, he could tell from the teenager's face alone that something was deeply wrong. Ahmet's skin looked waxy and sickly. It looked like he'd barely slept in days. Ahmet explained to Dr. Kaya that he had been taking TB antibiotics for a full month, but hadn't seen any sign of improvement. He felt weak and run down, and no matter how deeply he tried to breathe, he just couldn't get enough air. Dr. Kaya found this very worrying. If Ahmet had TB, then the antibiotics definitely should have helped him by now. But since his body was not responding, Dr. Kaya wondered what else might be causing Ahmet's symptoms. The doctor placed a stethoscope on Ahmet's chest. The teenager's heartbeat was normal, however, his breathing sounded shallow. Dr. Kaya told Ahmet that he wanted to run some tests to figure out why the TB medication was not working. He proposed starting with an X-ray of Ahmet's chest, followed by a full-body CT scan to provide a more detailed 3D rendering of Ahmet's organs. After that, Dr. Kaya suggested doing a bronchoscopy, which uses a thin, illuminated tube to examine the lungs and airways. Separately, he also wanted to test Ahmet's blood, mucus, and saliva for disease or infection. Ahmet told Dr. Kaya that his number one goal was getting back to his job at the factory. So whatever was necessary to make that happen, Dr. Kaya should do it. A few days later, after all the tests had been performed, Dr. Kaya opened a link on his computer to inspect Ahmet's results. And what he saw made him very concerned. Ahmet's chest X-ray looked speckled, particularly in his lungs. This indicated the presence of small foreign objects in Ahmet's lungs that shouldn't be there. His CT scan was more detailed. In addition to the foreign objects, it showed small growths in his lungs known as micronodules, which are often caused by respiratory illnesses or infections. And a culture test of his phlegm confirmed that Ahmet did not have TB. Dr. Kaya had suspected this when Ahmet's TB treatment didn't have any effect, but it was a relief to see it medically proven. But even so, ruling out TB didn't get Dr. Kaya any closer to figuring out what was causing Ahmet's symptoms. The cumulative picture provided by Ahmet's tests indicated that there was some sort of serious infection in his lungs. It just wasn't clear what that might be. So Dr. Kaya canceled Ahmet's TB medication and replaced it with a more general antibiotic. Dr. Kaya hoped this would ease Ahmet's symptoms, but he knew antibiotics wouldn't fix anything. Until he identified the infection in Ahmet's lungs, it wouldn't go away, and it very well might get worse. He just didn't know how much worse. Ahmet was already struggling to breathe, and less oxygen in his lungs meant less oxygen to his brain. And if that trend continued, things could get very bad very quickly. A few weeks later, Dr. Kaya was scanning the paperwork of the clinic's latest patients when something caught his eye. It was the intake form of a young man named Ali. He was 18, only a year younger than Ahmet, and suffering from very similar symptoms. Struggling to breathe, dry mouth, bad cough, unusual fatigue. Dr. Kaya decided to pay him a visit at the clinic. Maybe Ali could provide a clue as to what was making Ahmet so sick. After introducing himself, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to describe the history of his symptoms. And right away, one detail surprised him. Ali worked at the same garment factory as Ahmet. Dr. Kaya wondered why two otherwise healthy young men would have breathing issues or lung infections at their age. Neither of them smoked, and they spent their days doing physical labor, which in theory should have made them stronger, not weaker. Taking a seat by Ali's bed, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to walk him through a regular day at the factory. The jobs he did, the machines he used, what he ate, all of it. Ali explained that he started at the factory doing heavy labor. like loading and unloading fabric from the trucks to the machines and back. But over time, he was trained to do more skilled work, putting the finishing touches on garments before they were shipped to shops around the world. Ali and Amet's factory produced contemporary clothing for the latest fashion trends of the 2000s. Some of their factory's techniques were extremely new to the industry, and they sounded pretty strange to the doctor. But as Ali described his responsibilities, Dr. Kaya began to get an idea. And by the end of their chat, Dr. Kaya felt confident that he actually knew what was happening to both Ali and Amet. However, to be certain, he would need to examine samples of Ali and Amet's lung tissue under a microscope, and so he ordered lung biopsies for both men. Days later, the lung tissue samples confirmed Dr. Kaya's hunch. Both men were suffering from silicosis, a disease more commonly found in miners than garment factory workers. It's a lung disease caused by breathing silica, which is a common mineral in sand, gravel, clay, granite, and other rocks. Dr. Kaya had diagnosed cases of silicosis before, but only in workers who spent their days in tunnels or moving heavy stone materials and breathing in all kinds of rock dust. He would never have thought textile factory workers would have silicosis, since their product was fabric, not rock. But fashion tastes had changed in Europe and America in the early 2000s. One of the most popular and profitable items that Amet and Ali's factory produced was something called distressed jeans, and making them involved a lot of rock dust. To create the hip, faded denim look, workers used a high-pressure air compressor to blast sand up and down the legs of a pair of jeans. These silica particles in the sand gradually shredded the denim, giving the jeans a worn-in, weathered look. Like a lot of factories in Turkey at the time, Amet and Ali's workplace was crowded and lacked proper ventilation. This meant the silica particles stayed in the air long after the jeans were sandblasted. And so Amet and Ali breathed these particles in all day. And then at night, if they slept on the factory floor, they would continue to breathe in the silica during their sleep. Over time, the tiny crystals of silica scar and harden the delicate tissues in the lungs, making them less effective at processing oxygen. That's why the men's breathing became increasingly shallow. Sadly, silicosis damage is permanent, and it often leads to other respiratory illnesses. Lung cancer is a common outcome, and there is no cure. Even after Dr. Kaya identified Amet and Ali's condition, their health steadily worsened, and in 2008, both young men died from silicosis complications. And they were not alone either. 4 other workers at the same factory died as well, and 16 others suffered debilitating lung damage. In March of the following year, Turkey's Ministry of Health banned denim sandblasting, and thankfully, sandblasted jeans quickly fell out of fashion.